Welcome everybody to this month's Media Justice Salon, hosted by the Media Action Grassroots Network, also known as Magnet. Today's salon is entitled From Fake News to Real News, Making Truth Go Viral. My name is Angela, and I'm the membership organizer for Magnet, a project of the Center for Media Justice. Magnet represents nearly 100 organizations from all around the country. Together, we are working to advance a people-centered media justice agenda. And as a national network, we amplify local grassroots voices, ensuring that on-the-ground expertise of our members is influencing media policy debates. To learn more about the network, please visit us at mag-net.org. Our host for today's salon is Tia, the national organizer of Black Alliance for Just Immigration, also known as BAJI. Thank you so much for joining us, Tia. We're sorry that we weren't able to figure out your video, but we're happy to have you. And I'm hoping you can share a little bit more about yourself.
Yes, no, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be hosting. Sorry about the tech issues with my video, but the picture of me is great, so that's fine. Again, everyone, my name is Tia. Also, I'm the national organizer for the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. We are a nonprofit organization organizing at Black immigrant and African American communities at the intersection of racial justice and migrant rights. As in my role with BAJI, I coordinate the Black Immigration Network, which is our national network of over 50 organizations across the country, as well as individuals is organizing in and leading in Black communities. I'm really excited to be hosting today's salon, talking about fake news, and really glad that BAJI is an anchor member of Magnet, because the work that we do in BAJI around media and introducing Black immigrant narratives, helping to both politicize and inform and empower ethnic media, where a lot of Black immigrant communities get their news and information, is really important. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. I'm really excited about the opportunity to host this discussion with such dynamic leaders on this really important topic.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tia. So before we begin, I would just encourage our speakers to mute their phones right now. We're getting a little bit of feedback. Thank you. So logistics. So for our folks who are here listening, we just wanted to let you know that the webinar will be recorded, and we will make sure to share it on our website in the next week or two. We also encourage you to tweet along with us. You can follow us at Media Action, and you can use the hashtag Media Justice. And for folks who are looking to ask questions, which we're hoping you will, we just want to make sure that you see the control panel on the side. And if you just click on the part where it says questions, that's where you can submit your questions. We'll get it here on the back end, and we'll make sure to share it out at the very end when we open it up for Q&A. So next, we'd love to be able to introduce you all to our 4 amazing guests who are going to help us explore the impact of fake news on communities of color. So let's learn a little bit more about each of our experts. Dani McClain. Dani writes and reports on race, reproductive health, policy, and politics. She's a contributing writer at The Nation and a fellow with the Nation Institute. Dani's writing has appeared in outlets including Slate, Talking Points Memo, Al Jazeera America, Colorlines, and Ebony.com. She reported on schools for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and interned on the Miami Herald Metro desk. Next, we have Manolia. Manolia is a multimedia journalist and strategist who tells stories that feed the spirit and amplify voices that seek liberation. Currently, Manolia is the associate director at the Media Consortium, a network of leading independent media whose mission is to grow the impact of the independent news sector. There, she manages editorial collaborations among member outlets, spearheads the hashtag TMC in color, and curates independent media coverage of the movement for Black lives. Next, we have Tracie. Tracie is the founder of Digitocracy.org, which is focused on the media and its impact on diverse communities. She's also a senior fellow with the Democracy Fund and a 2016 Knight Fellow at Stanford University, where she researched how techniques used in online advertising help to reach specific customers that can then be used by newsrooms to reach news consumers and to grow audience. Her work and byline have also regularly appeared in publications like the Washington Post, Newsweek, and People magazines. And finally, we have Joe Torres. Joe is a senior external affairs director at Free Press, where he advocates in Washington to ensure that our nation's media policies serve the public interest and builds coalitions to broaden the movement's base. He is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, News for All the People, The Epic Story of Race and the American Media. Before joining Free Press, Joe worked at the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and was also a journalist for several years. So thank you all for joining us. We know how hectic your schedules are, and we're so super excited to have you with us. I'll pass it back to Tia now.
Great, thanks, Angela. So really excited for today's discussion, and it's really timely and important. So I'm going to share just a little bit of background, and then we'll hear from our panelists. And so, really, we're seeing it everywhere, the threat of fake news and its important impact on our communities. And we really need to discuss the roots of fake news in white nationalism and how it's facilitating and increasing hate speech and violence against people of color. And so today we're going to discuss the historic relationship between media and white nationalism, such as ownership of radio stations by the Ku Klux Klan or the use of newspapers to incite violence against Black communities in the South during Reconstruction. Lastly, we'll examine strategies for pushing back against these hurtful narratives and the opportunities for resistance that an open internet provides us. Together, we'll identify ways to decipher fake news from the real and how we can all play a role in making the truth go viral and get away from these alternative facts such as they were. Today, we invite you to listen to our invited guests, and we also want to throw in your thoughts and questions. For those of us who are joining on the webinar, if you want to chime in the chat box, and then we'll also open for questions a little bit later using the webinar functionality as well. So for our speakers, I'm going to be first asking a question of Joe, then Manolia and Tracie, and then Dani. I'll, of course, present the question to you, but I just wanted to let you all know what order we're going to be going in. And then we are allowing about 2 minutes for you to respond to the questions, just so that we can have enough time to have a really robust discussion, as well as time for follow-up and interaction as well. So first, we're going to hear from you, Joe. Are you ready?
Yep, I'm here.
Awesome. Yes. So you have a great book out there, News for All the People, that guides readers through the history of media as a tool for freedom, as well as has been used as a tool of oppression against people of color. I wanted to ask if you can share a little bit more about that with us, and how has, in particular, how you talk about how media and misinformation can incite violence.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, CMJ. And this issue of fake news, to me, I mean, it's a real problem, of course, because of the way with technology and the internet and how these bots and all that can just really overwhelm us with information that's false. But the concept of fake news in itself, and there's nothing new about it, in my opinion, especially when it comes to communities of color. As we talk about in our book, there's been a long history in the mainstream dominant white media to mislead the public about communities of color, about people of color, in order to further empire, to fight against abolition, for a territorial expansion, against immigration and migration of people of color within this country. It's been a constant theme within the media system and with the dominant white media, in order to pass policies that basically support white supremacy. It's part of the racism is a part of the American narrative from the very get-go, and the media is critically important in uplifting white supremacy, a white racial narrative in this country. So, for example, whether it's the Chinese, and I just got a couple of quotes I'm going to read, for instance, like in 1853, when Chinese were migrating to the West Coast, immigrating to the West Coast, the San Francisco Daily Alta, California, for example, said that Chinese are cunning and deceitful. Quote, they don't mix with our people, and it's undesirable that they should. This kind of like xenophobia helped to spread across the country within the mainstream media that helped to result in the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. When it comes to lynching, you had few Southern editors that were willing to denounce lynching, for example, and you had like the Atlanta Constitution at the time offering a $500 reward for an example for a gentleman named Sam Holt, who was allegedly raped a white woman, and he was captured and hung. Or you have a columnist, a famous columnist at the time named Bill Arp, who was a former Confederate soldier, widely syndicated throughout the South. And, he wrote like in 1902, I repeat what I said before, let the good work go on, lynch them, shoot them, burn them, right? You had like mob violence, right? And like in Wilmington, North Carolina, with the publisher of the News and Observer, Josephus Daniels, who was a very powerful editor, publisher, and became an important figure within federal government years later, who orchestrated a coup of the local government in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, because it was a government that had blacks in leadership, and it was trying to fight for voting rights and public education and economic justice. And it led to the burning down of the black newspaper. It led to dozens of black folks being killed, and hundreds more shipped out, literally put on trains and shipped out of the city. The paper actually apologized for it almost 100 years later. Over 100 years later, actually apologized for that effort, for its role in that massacre. There's countless examples of the mainstream media throughout our history supporting mob violence. For example, in Omaha, Nebraska, like in 1919, the paper there, the Omaha Bee, it was upset that this Democratic person became the mayor, and he was going to supposedly reform corruption in the city. So they ran a string of articles about lawlessness within the black community and a black crime wave. This resulted in a person named Will Brown being accused of rape, and he was dragged out of his jail cell and hung and burned, and body was paraded around the city. These are dominant white media companies. There's some of them that still exist today, right? WTOP here in Washington, D.C. was once a Klan owned by a newspaper that was an organ of the Klan. Today's an all-news station. The way in which the narratives have changed, people of color are a threat, were covered as a threat to society. That narrative still hasn't changed. We're still a threat to society. So I'll leave it as this. We have Donald Trump in there. He ran on this narrative. This narrative wasn't, as the media now is concerned with fake news and how to deal with it. The people of color were the canary in the coal mine that said that this guy was a disaster, right? And we had a media system that enabled it, supported it, turned his cameras on. It was great for ratings. The guy for CBS, the president of CBS, said Donald Trump may be bad for America, but he's good for CBS. He should have said racism is good for business. And so, and so the nature of it is still very much embedded within our media system, that someone who can play on racial stereotypes and racism and white supremacy. We have white nationalists in our government, and it's not normal, right? So I can go on and on, but the media has enabled this, has played a critical role in enabling this, and always has. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that grounding, Joe. It's really important that we understand the history and the roots of it. And you gave some really definite clear-cut examples and even connecting it to today. And it's really important that we understand the history of how the media has been used as a tool by white nationalist forces, right? Both to shape narratives, introduce fake narratives, as well as villainize and demonize the communities of color. And now we're going to transition over to Manolia and ask you, and then I'll follow up with Tracie. What are some of the current issues that you see where fake news is playing a significant role today in influencing mainstream media narratives and social policies?
Hi, Tia. Thank you for hosting us, and thank you to our Media Justice colleagues for hosting this conversation, a very important one. specifically, one of the biggest issues in the country right now, and I'm so glad that Judge Joseph gives us that grounding on how they were treating Chinese immigrants, how they're treating immigrants in this country now hasn't changed much since then. And immigrants that have always been historically misrepresented so that it could be dehumanized and have policies that further marginalize them implemented, it's still happening. So currently, as you all know, Baji and many other groups around the country have been working to save temporary protected status for almost 50,000 Haitians who were in danger of being deported. And the administration just this week extended TPS for 6 months. But about a week and a half ago, there was a story that came out that the administration was actually looking for examples of criminality to paint Haitians as criminal people, as criminals, and so therefore they shouldn't deport them. Right. And this story that broke, I mean, I think based on the reactions that folks got, and of course the amazing organizing that happened on the ground and via social media campaigns, that it played a role in them deciding to extend TPS because it showed the machinations. It basically lifted the veil to demonstrate how the U.S. government actually paints immigrants of color in this way. And I think investigations like that story help us see and help the broader public understand how the media system is used to marginalize people, especially when it comes to immigration. I think this is the big issue. I mean, we're seeing this everywhere, from whether it's mass incarceration, detention, whether it's education reform. There's not a major issue area in this country, policy issue area in this country, that you don't see the sort of either legacy media or mass media playing a role in supporting the administration's efforts to marginalize folks.
Thank you so much for that, Manolia, and especially looking at the example of a Black immigrant issue and how, we've seen, especially under this administration, not only just the narratives, but also literally, crafting stories around, immigrant criminality as a way to justify deporting people, as well as to justify really harsh policies rooted in the campaign, as Joe shared. And then also thank you also for sharing an example of the way that through social media and independent media and good journalism, right, exposing the truth, we were able to use that information to help on the right side of things in, supporting the grassroots effort to have Haitian TPS extended, which the administration announced earlier this week. So thank you for showing, both sides of that really great example. And now we want to go next to Tracie. Tracie, can you share, what are you seeing now around what role this fake news and propagandizing is playing in influencing mainstream narratives and our social policies?
Hi, thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I didn't hear the last part of your question, but I want to agree with what I've heard already. Historically, the media has perpetuated state violence on Black and brown bodies, and we continue to see biased and slanted reporting that seeks to marginalize people of color. What's more interesting, I think, is kind of some of the more nuanced types of coverage that I've been seeing lately. Mainstream media has been talking a lot about fake news, and that coverage has tended to focus on conservative media and alt-right media. But I'd like to talk about how mainstream media undermines its own credibility, and they don't realize how they continue to make this happen. One example to illustrate this point is the coverage that we saw immediately after last year's election, in which there was an inordinate amount of coverage of working class Americans, and that narrative focused on, it was a default for white Americans. It completely excluded Black and brown people from that working class narrative, and I think that rendered all the reports coming in after that election, and rendered those reports, they might have been factually correct, but they were still inaccurate because they left out whole communities. Another, a lesser example, I guess, is a story that came up after the election again. It was about LeBron James and how LeBron James refused to stay at Trump Tower in New York. The report, again, was factually correct. LeBron James did refuse to stay at that hotel. But the reporting, all the rest reporting suggested he did so because he was a Hillary Clinton supporter. Well, yes, LeBron James was a Hillary Clinton supporter, but that was not the reason he did not stay at Trump Tower. LeBron James did not stay at Trump Tower because of the racism that was associated with that became associated with the Trump brand. And so those reports that all these different, credible news outlets came out with, produced, was rendered to many people who look and sound like me as fake news. And so I think there needs to be more discussion about what we mean when we say fake news. And I also think we shouldn't just use the brush to paint conservative media as the purveyors of fake news, because we have several mainstream media outlets who also produce the same kind of fake news.
Thank you so much, Tracie, for bringing that other angle into it and talking about, exactly what is it that we're talking about. I did want to ask Dani, what is the role for journalists, especially journalists of color, in ensuring that our stories and our truths are cutting through this static and making an impact in, addressing some of the issues that Tracie just raised up about, in how the accuracy, right, of reporting and the context that's being given. So what's the role for journalists to play in this?
I'm so glad that Tracie raised, first of all, thank you to CMJ and Magnet and everyone who's listening and my fellow panelists. This is a really important conversation. I'm glad to be a part of it. I'm so thankful for what Tracie just brought up, that her example about these stories just after the election, this decision that was clearly made in newsrooms, that the focus should be on the working class, and then as she pointed out, that the default was white people. I'm sure that at that moment, she might just need to swoop her off. There were a lot of hardworking, journalists of color in those newsrooms.
Hardworking journalists of color and the mom.
Yeah. But I'm an independent journalist. I work right here. But who were in those newsrooms at the times, in these places, asking their editors and their colleagues to think critically about whether that was the right thing to do. So sometimes I think that work goes unnoticed and unrecognized because sometimes they're not successful. But what I will say, as someone who does write a lot for progressive media and left media, I do think that we play an important role. And what I'll say is, the stories that I tell, some of it is related to what I do and what I find interesting as a person of color, but I think a lot of it is related to the ties that I have to organizing communities and to people who are doing racial justice work. So I think that for me, what's the most important thing is to be well-sourced, to develop authentic relationships with people who are doing organizing, because those are the stories that I'm interested in understanding and in lifting up. I think my understanding is that those of you who are on the call, many of you are media producers, content producers. And one thing I would say to you is that it's really important to understand when a piece of information or a thought calls for a tweet or a Facebook post, for a letter to the editor in response to something that you've seen, for an op-ed or a piece of commentary, or for a reported feature. And for some of you, a story that calls for a reported feature is one that's best pitched to someone who is a reporter and who has the skills and the resources to be able to really carry out the interviews and the research necessary to tell a full story. And so this is, I think, maybe content for a different webinar. It's probably one that you've had before, or that maybe you just know this, but the importance of pitching and making sure that journalists know what you're working on, know what you're seeing in your community, so that, you know, if they are in that newsroom where their editor has decided that the working class is made in the Midwest and the Rust Belt is made up solely of white people, that reporter who you have this ongoing relationship with can come right back and say, oh, actually, here's this great story about this group of Black workers at this auto plant in Michigan or whatever. But hopefully you understand your role in helping to shape the racial justice analysis of journalists who can tell these stories. You know, there are people who I call on within the reproductive justice movement, Monica Simpson at Sister Song, Alicia Waters and Jana Zenzi at Forward Together. Just like there are people who I call on within the Movement for Black Lives community, Mervyn Marciano at Blackbird. These are people who I lean on to help me better understand these issues, and they're kind enough to share their analysis with me so that I can, you know, make use of that analysis when I'm reporting on a story. And so that's what I think is the role of, again, not just journalists of color, but people who are interested in lifting up these stories from communities that are too often overlooked. I think it's never been more important. There's never been a more important time for us to be maintaining authentic relationships with our sources who can help direct our attention where it needs to be.
Thank you so much for that really insightful and like thorough perspective. I want to just have just a follow-up example. If you can share a little bit about your coverage of the most recent Mama's Day bailout, and talking about how, again, you know, that's a really great example of how, you know, we can make the truth go viral and shine a spotlight on the work that's being done in the grassroots, as well as, you know, getting the truth out about who communities of color are. And I just wanted to ask if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. You know, I think this is an important question. Like, the way that the question was put to me is, how do we make the truth go viral? That is probably one of the most successful pieces that I've written, if you judge success by how far it traveled on social media. And I think what I will say is that it's not up to me or the outlet that publishes me whether or not something goes viral. I try to focus on the reporting and the storytelling, and the strength of the piece determines whether something, you know, determines how far something goes and its reach. And so, you know, again, so I'm thinking, so one thing that I do think about that Mama's Day bailout story, some of the reasons why I think that it traveled so far so fast is, I think that piece came out, if I remember correctly, during a news week where Comey was fired. You know, these past 2 weeks before Trump left the country for his worldwide tour or whatever he's up to now, there was just kind of back to back, like, oh my God, you know, for those of us who just hang on to the news cycle, it was like constant whiplash and overwhelm. And I think that story landed at a moment where people really wanted something hopeful and inspiring. And the idea that here was a piece that explained the strategy behind this plan for Mother's Day that was being undertaken by these organizers within the Movement for Black Lives. I think it was good news at a moment where people really needed good news. And, you know, it's something that I struggle with, not struggle with, but some people think that the only real journalism or good journalism is watchdog reporting or like these hard-hitting kind of exposés. They're important for sure. I mean, there's no question. But there's also something to be said for stories that explain. I don't consider myself an investigative journalist. More so what I do, I think, is explanatory journalism, where I try to explain maybe a debate around an idea. Like I wrote this kind of explanatory piece about long-acting reversible contraception that got into these long simmering conversations within the reproductive justice movement. I think the Mama's Day bailout story, even though it was shorter, it was maybe like an 800-word, 1,000-word piece, was that. It was an attempt to explain this strategy behind this direct action that was being undertaken. So I guess in short, I would say it's not in any journal, it's not up to me whether a piece goes viral, and any journalist who's thinking in the writing process is, how do I make this go viral? I have some questions for that person. It's really up to how does it land with the audience, because it's the readers are going to determine whether or not the piece travels far and wide. And I think, again, it goes back to this question of what are your connections to the communities that you're reporting on? If I had told a story about the Mama's Day bailout and the organizers and my sources were like, this is not what we said to her, and like, this is a strange representation of what we're doing, the story wouldn't have gone anywhere, because I, you know, as Tracie said, even if I had gotten all my facts right, but I was inaccurate, it wouldn't have moved. So I think it goes back to the point that she made about accuracy and fairness and, you know, correctly and accurately telling stories.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. So I want to kind of shift our discussion a little bit and talk about, as Dani just gave such a great example of, you know, what is working and what are the ways that our communities can help to fight back, and, you know, tools and specific skills that we need to beef up on to filter out fake news. And so I think I want to start with Joe again. How can our communities build the skills to decipher fake news? And do you have examples that you want to share of, you know, news outlets or folks that are getting it right now?
I kind of feel you know, in the grams in that this is hard right now, because there is the forces on the right, for the most part, they're getting really sophisticated. They're using a lot of bots and all these other technologies. They're using the openness of the internet itself to be able to spread misinformation. And the weakness we have is that we have a mainstream media system where there's been a collapse in journalism over the past decade or so. And so we have fewer journalists than ever being asked to do more. And social media really sets an agenda. You know, often it sets it helps, often, particularly with the dominant broadcast and cable news, it actually sets an agenda of what they're going to cover. You know, it's easy. You know, it's kind of an easier thing to decide what you're going to cover when you have less resources. My hope, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question completely right now, but I kind of feel like my actually hope, and this all live within an ecosystem where people of color own very few media outlets, right? And so we're the ones who are, I think, harmed disproportionately the most. And we can see who we have in administration. This is where I think, like, organizing is critically important, and the openness of the internet. And I think, you know, folks within BLM, of course, and all that, and everyone on this phone can speak to it personally, particularly on how you've had to use the openness of the internet to push back on narratives, you know, and to challenge narratives. And for me, this is why, like, media policy is really important. Because we have to make sure the internet remains open, first of all, so we can able to push back. Imagine without the open internet, us not being able to push back on these narratives. It's already hard enough. But you know, at the end of the day, I think a harder lift is going to be for us is we have a media. We are going to be a country soon where we make up the majority of the U.S. population, but yet we don't control the you know, construction and distribution of our own narratives. And
got it.
That is so we have to really transform this media system. But I'm going to stop there. I think who's doing it right? I think the media is doing a little bit better job now, because they're personally being challenged by it. But I'll leave it up to the other journalists to give good examples of who's doing a better job.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that. So Tracie, I understand that you also might have some, that you do have some examples about outlets that are getting it right.
I want to go back to what Dani said, actually, and the questions you asked Dani about her piece about Mama's Day bailout. I saw that story, and it was a really, really good story. I enjoyed it. I think there is a real hunger for news and information that centers people, real people, in stories, instead of powerful authoritarians. There's a lot of reporting out there that focuses or centers people in power. But what was really good about Dani's story, and I think the reason it went viral, is because it centered real people, and people are hungry for that, and people want that kind of information. So to answer your question directly, who's getting it right? Let me see, how can I say this? We in terms of mainstream media are really good at reacting right now. For example, All Digitocracy posted a piece today in which Newsweek magazine published a story. It's a ridiculous story, but it's the headline on the story was new bachelorette Rachel Lindsay is proving Black women actually do like men outside their race. That I don't know if that story. I don't even know if that story is accurate. I don't think that Black women have never chosen men outside their race, but it was very narrow, and I don't think it did not paint an accurate picture about Black women and who we choose to date. And social media pushed back on that story. So Newsweek reacted to the outrage they saw on social media and pulled that story down. Also, just this week, Blavity posted a story about the New York Times published a piece comparing Kim Kardashian and her behind to a Black woman, Sarah Barton, who was used in a circus decades ago, and compared Kim Kardashian to Sarah Barton. It was awful. Social media was outraged, of course, but Blavity stepped up and corrected the record and took the New York Times to task for publishing that piece. So those were both reactions to poor reporting or fake news, whatever you want to call it. And so I think we've gotten pretty good at that. What we have not gotten really good at is being proactive about keeping this stuff out of the universe in the first place. So when I think of people who are getting it right or somewhat right, I think of people like Dani or Blavity, NBC Black, The Undefeated. Those are places where Latino rebels, those are places that are they're run and the content is controlled by people of color. Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. That's another outlet. Another round. These whether they're podcasts or publications, they are producing journalism that is reflective of the communities that exist in our country, that exist in our society, that exist in our world, and they're setting the record straight. What needs to happen is that these voices, these independent voices like Dani's, like Blavity, they need more support. So one of the things that I do as a senior fellow at the Democracy Fund, we really are looking to some of these, to how we can create collaborations between these more independent voices and some more mainstream media outlets, or how do we give them larger platforms so that they can produce more content to wider audiences.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tracie. So next we want to ask then, what can our communities do to build the skills to decipher fake news? And are there tools or specific skills that we need to beef up to filter fake news? And I want to ask first Dani and then Manolia.
Yes. So I think that this is one of the critical questions of our time. And I encourage people who are on the call to check out the resources that Magnet has provide, I'm not sure where they'll be available, but one of the links that I suggested be included is to this blog post that someone named Amy Sunny put together. She's a board member of CMJ. She's also an Oakland librarian. And in her blog post, she links to a lot of different resources and just talks about how we can begin to put together a diverse media diet for ourselves, and how we can judge, tell when a report is biased, and kind of educate ourselves to become better news consumers. So I appreciate people like Amy who are helping us, who are guiding us through this process. One I just want to mention, it's kind of related to this question, what Tracie just mentioned about that the New York Times headline trying to frame, using Kim Kardashian as a way to talk about the Hottentot Venus. It was so embarrassing. And one of the things I thought was, like, Twitter did a good job at shaming the New York Times, but within that newsroom, I hope people made that copy editor feel really bad. Like, I hope someone said, like, you're really uneducated actually about this, and we need to beef up your kind of historical knowledge and understanding so you don't make a mistake like this again. Because it was just such an error. And I think too often when these media, when reporters or media journalists make mistakes like this, it's not framed. I think we need to do more shaming. I think we need to, like, this isn't, you didn't just make Black people feel bad. What you just did shows that your education is really lacking. And I think that this question of, deciphering fake news, just to switch gears a little bit back to this question, to me, it's a larger question about how we're educated starting in grade school. It's a question of civics education, how we learn, who is teaching us how to read the newspaper, how we're learning to think about an individual reporter's bias, or how we're learning, I like to tell people that when I was at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, like, this isn't specific to that paper or any particular, all reporters do this. I had to do a cops beat, a cops, like, fill in for the cops reporter maybe once a month. And my whole job during that, however long my 6-hour shift was to sit and listen to the police scanner. That's how newspapers think of covering criminal justice issues, is having somebody sit and listen to the scanner. Like, no. And
wow.
That's something that, and of course there are reporters who are on the criminal justice beat who are doing deeper reporting, of course. But they're thinking, what are the police telling us are the crimes that are being committed? And then if you hear something interesting on the scanner, you go over to the police department and you listen to their press conference on it. And that's your primary source.
Yeah.
This is something that we should learn when we're kids. And so I think this question of deciphering fake news really leads to a larger question about how we're educated, and how we might begin to transform civics education at the grade school level and beyond.
Yeah, got it. Definitely. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Understanding what is the narrative, understanding what is the frame that the news is being delivered through. How about you, Manolia? Same question. What can our communities do to build the skills to decipher fake news? And are there specific skills that we need to beef up, or are there tools that we can use?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to answer the question previously, because I actually represent over 80 independent media outlets. So the first thing I want to say is to support independent media that has been telling real news for a very long time. And Dani is one of our stellar writers with The Nation. And so, like just to give people an example, when we say independent media, what are we talking about? Some of the folks that Tracie listed up, definitely, as well as our members of TMC include the Mother Jones, Democracy Now!, Color Lines, In These Times, The Young Turks, Grist, Rewire, The Real News Network. And these outlets cover the issues that we really care about, from immigration, racial justice, reproductive justice, climate change, education reform, mass incarceration, economic justice, and new economy. So these are outlets that are not only covering issues we care about, but are covering the movements that are pushing this country forward on these issues as well. So that's the first key thing. Find key outlets that can give you the information you need to make the best decisions. And then the second thing I would say is for folks to rely on the support of folks who are within the movement, because what happens is within movement spaces and sort of advocate spaces, people share stories from outlets they care about. Hence, Dani's example of how her story became viral. It's because there were real people behind that were pushing these issues, because these issues are from their communities. And I think it's important for us to continue seeing our colleagues as good sources on credibility of news, right? Like for you to know like what is credible, you got to go with folks who you already know are credible. And a lot of times I think we tend to get caught up in sharing a lot of stuff in the mainstream, and then when some of the like independent media stories break through, sometimes it feels like it's like a one-off thing, when there's a whole media sector that's dedicated to fighting against the mainstream, right? So I think that's really it's a really important thing. And the third thing I would say is strategy. I think that a lot of our communities need to understand not only what Dani says, understand how the news is produced, but to understand what the news sector is and how diverse it is, and understand how to develop strategies based on the different news platforms. And if anybody wants to talk to me about that afterwards, I know that CMJ will be sharing our contact info.
Yeah, we're going to share some info after.
Yeah. So
yeah, and we'll share also some of the links that you talked about.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to develop trainings and workshops, seminars, and partner with independent media to help develop strategies to really make the real news go viral.
Excellent, excellent. Great tips. So now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Just as a reminder, the way that you are able to do that is by submitting your questions into the chat box at the right. And we already have a couple that are percolating. And so we're going to first ask Eileen Palacios. Eileen, are you on mute? All right, excuse me, unmuted. If not, I can. Hello?
Yes, hi.
There we go. Hey, Eileen. Yeah, let's hear your question for the panelists, please.
Okay, sure. I can just restate it. Yeah, so it's kind of more of a broad question about this idea of objectivity and kind of how we assert our experiences and perspectives. Because in my experience, there's been kind of an idea of that writers or journalists or creators of color can't be objective about our communities, our experiences. So I was wondering what kind of feedback or advice that you can give regarding kind of how to still assert our stories and kind of have them have a broad sort of appeal, I guess, if you want to call it that. So yeah, it's kind of just for any panelist, I think it would be applicable.
I mean, I think for the question, I think it's an important one. I think that—
Yeah, go ahead, Manolia.
That was Dani talking. Should I continue?
Yes, that was Dani. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think so I think the use of this word objectivity is not always helpful, but what is helpful is I think about rigor and fairness. And I'll just use a quick example. That story that I mentioned about long-acting reversible contraception, which is like IUDs and hormonal implants. I had been hearing that these birth control methods were being really encouraged through birth control counseling and through kind of these trial programs where the birth control was being provided for free for low-income women, primarily women of color, Black and Latino women. And so I've been hearing these rumblings in the reproductive justice community that like, well, why are they kind of forcing this provider-controlled birth control on us? Because with these methods, you need a doctor or a nurse practitioner or somebody to put it in for you. You can't just take it out when you're ready. So I was very curious to do a reported story about this debate, this question, why is this particular method being promoted when a lot of women of color have questions about it, given the history of reproductive coercion and forced sterilization. If I had just written a story that only talked to people who were voicing those concerns, then I would have missed out on what I learned when I talked to people who feel like there are very good reasons why, you know, this type of birth control method is better than like condoms or the birth control pill or something like that. Which is to say that the best way to respond to these accusations that people who are people of color or journalists who have some kind of background as organizers or whatever, this I've heard it a lot, this idea that we can't be real reporters. The best, I won't say the best thing to do, but my response to that has just been to report the hell out of stories and to talk to as many perspectives as I can on an issue. It doesn't necessarily mean that in my framing I give equal weight to all perspectives, but I do need to be, I need to know what these various perspectives are, even if some of them might be considered by some to be white supremacist or racist or classist or whatever. So I will just say that as a practitioner, my response is to kind of just show that people who have these misperceptions about what I can do, show them that they're wrong.
Great, great. Next question, we're going to ask Manolia to share more about the what's a concrete example of one strategic thing that you would want to work with other people around. For example, around the media trainings, I'll share that Manolia helped with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration and last year at the Ben Kinship Assembly and doing media training at our biannual membership gathering. Can you share some other kind of strategic example such as that?
Well, so I'll share two examples, one for our organizational and two from me personal as a strategist. So organizational, the Media Consortium right now, we are in a partnership with the New Economy Coalition. These are comrades that are doing incredible work to help expand the public awareness of solidarity economy. You know, how can we develop co-ops and different economic alternatives that are sustainable for communities of color and historically marginalized communities. And so we have one of our members, the Laura Flanders Show, who's doing trainings for the actual members of the coalition. And then we are training our independent journalists. We have a cohort of 10 journalists who will get trainings on the new economy and be able to report stories that we can create several stories around the solidarity economy effort. So that's a particular way. So that means we can partner with an organization that has a particular issue in any of the areas that we focus. So like I said, our big issues are immigration, racial justice, reproductive justice, climate change, education reform, mass incarceration, economic inequality, and of course, money in politics. And so, you know, any of these big issues, if you work on any of this and you want to partner with us to strategically figure out how to get more stories, more specific stories out there, then feel free to contact us directly. And me, myself personally, I do trainings for media trainings for advocates. So building relationships with media, developing strategic story outlines. So in other words, figuring out first of all, how do you know you have a story? How do you pitch the story? How do you develop a relationship with media? How do you know which is the right media to pitch the story to, right? And then also, how do you develop your own stories? Like if your organization has a blog or your organization is part of a series of narratives, how do you pull together, if you're a coalition working on a particular issue, how do you pull together your own narrative to push that in a social media campaign as well? So
awesome. So I just, in the interest of time, we want to make sure that we get to close out and hear from one of our other panelists again, but all of those are really excellent examples and tips and ways that folks can work together or with Media Consortium directly. Thanks so much, Manolia. So the last question, and this is for any of the panelists, what can reporters of color do to change these destructive narratives about people of color in the media?
I'll jump in for 2 seconds, and I'll say that something that people of color and reporters of color have done throughout history, and it's kind of answering the question you first asked before about who's got getting it right. I think there's a long history of communities of color, reporters of color, addressing issues of institutional structural racism within this reporting, within the reporting itself, and exposing that. Too often, coverage of race in the media, it's the dominant media, it tends to inflame rather than inform. And I think there's a long history of reporters of color going way back to the current day who actually shed a light on the structural institutional racism and discrimination that center it within their stories. So that's what I say. We need more of that kind of reporting.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to all of our panelists. This has been a really great discussion, very nuanced, very thorough, and really great perspectives, and giving grounding in history, and even shifting the focus not only on what's happening negatively, but also what are some really great things that are happening, and what are some things that we can be doing to combat the demonization of our communities and these really harmful narratives. I'm going to pass it now back to Angela to close us out.
Great, thank you so much, Tia. On the screen right now, for folks who are interested in connecting with our speakers today and also our host, we are listing their email address there. For folks who are asking on the back end around resources and the links that our presenters mentioned, we will make sure to send that along to you within the next couple of days. So if you RSVP'd, we have your email, we'll make sure to follow up and send it to you. Thank you everybody for attending. I know we went a little bit over time. Tia, thank you so much. A special thank you to you, for hosting us and really just doing a fantastic job of guiding our presenters through this conversation. A recording of the webinar will be available on the website in the next couple of weeks. And just one little note for our listeners, once you log off, you are going to receive a short survey in your browser window to evaluate the webinar. We take these evaluations very seriously. We're always looking to improve. So please make sure you take a minute to fill it out. We definitely value your feedback. And then lastly, just a reminder that Magnet is a grassroots-powered organization that relies on the contributions of our friends to build power and to win victories. We hope you'll consider making a donation to Magnet. And if you're a grassroots organization, you love what you heard, you'd love to connect further, definitely make sure to reach out to me if you're interested in becoming a member of the network. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.